If you have a hallucination or a dream that says Jesus now is risen in a body,
but he didn't have it in a dream. There's nothing about him having a dream.
That might be another word of the terminology.
That's true. Hallucination and that being a genuine, actual appearance of a god. We don't have the kind of records we need to tell that distinction, to tell those two apart. Are you banking your reputation on that? That if I go out now on the internet...
I know. Hey, trust me. I know at least with the big religions that didn't happen. And so this is, by definition, extraordinary for Christianity.
You're saying no one has been against a religion and then has converted to that religion?
No, I'm saying with the biggest religions.
Everybody hear me? All right, good. Please get your questions ready because your turn will come. I hope everybody's starting to get buzzed. But we might want to get back up here because obviously we have two historians here and they're sort of geeking out and having a good time. But I'm not a historian. I've never even stayed at a Holiday Inn. And a lot of these folks aren't historians either. So maybe we should get down first to terminology. For example, the word is reliable. What exactly as a historian is reliable? For example, you seem to say, well, those in the faith cannot be reliable. But if that's the case, then there is no Muhammad because most of the writings came from Muslims. So is reliable an eyewitness, contemporary, or give us a definition of reliable? Why don't we start with Dr. Carrier and then Dr. Bass can sort of join in.
Yeah, obviously it varies from document to document and types of things. Ideally in history you want converging lines of evidence. So in the case of Muhammad, for instance, and the debate over that issue hinges on whether certain coins and letters and stuff written around the time refer to Muhammad or not. And if you have things like that, casual mentions of people that don't have any particular reason to be making the story up, or aren't people that have had the visions and therefore are just repeating what their visions are, you need something like that. You need a third-party corroboration, or you need a really abundant quantity of eyewitness evidence, or you need a historian who actually tells you what his sources were and what his methods were, and you can tell from his description, or her description as the case may be, that's actually a pretty reliable method. You need to be able to tell the difference, for example, between the Acts of John and any other story that someone claims to have been traveling with a guy and did these things. The Acts of John, for example, is an obviously fictional text. So how do you tell the difference between that and any other, something that you would consider reliable? That's the definition of reliability, and that's the challenge that we're facing with here.
Mm-hmm. I would agree mostly. I would say physical evidence would be the number one thing you want. Coins or inscriptions, things like that. Apart from that, you want multiple attestation. You want independent accounts. You want you say reliable historian, but a historian can believe crazy things and still give you true knowledge from the ancient world. So a good example, paralleling to Papias, he did that, which I obviously think that Papias quote is hilarious and ridiculous, and I don't think it's true. But to parallel it with Josephus, we would all agree, is a reliable historian that gives us great knowledge of first century Judaism, Galilee, the AD 70 war, and Josephus has ridiculous things. I mean, he has this one story where a rock hits a pregnant woman and her baby flies out, 100 feet. So, I mean, do we throw Josephus away because of that? No. Josephus believes weird things, but we as historians, we try to sift through and find, well, what can we trust from Josephus and what can we not trust? So, I think multiple attestation, independent accounts, things like that are the things we really want. Close to the event, as close to the event as possible, early. So.
Yeah, and you need to avoid occasions where there's deep suspicion. So if there's a case where the author has a definite motive to actually convince you of something, their word is not going to be enough anymore. And you have cases like Josephus is a good example where there are a number of scholars now who doubt his story of Masada, even though it's fundamental to the Israeli military today. Because they actually have soldiers go to Masada and swear swear in at Masada. But historians actually are increasingly starting to doubt that story because it sounds very suspicious. It should be no way he knows what happened at Masada because they were all killed. And they all killed themselves, supposedly. But he says there were 2 women who escaped, and those are my sources. But it just, coincidentally, Gamala, the same thing happened. 2 women escaped and just happened to tell me about the suicide story of what happened at Gamala. When you start seeing suspicious stories like that, Josephus wants to tell these stories of heroism. It looks suspicious. And then you say, okay, I don't trust this. I need more evidence than this. And in general, historians are very suspicious of things that aren't mundane political history, like military movements, offices, things like that. When you're looking at narratives, there's an increasing amount of doubt, and you need much better kind of accounts of things. Eyewitness accounts would be good, but even those, we know people can make stuff up. So it is a challenge, and we have, usually as historians, we have to accept that there's a lot of stuff that we can't know about the ancient world. A lot of it might even be 50-50. Some of it's worse than that. But the reality is we don't have the kind of knowledge of the things that happened in the ancient world that we have for even like 200 years ago, which are marvelously well documented with newspaper articles and government documents and so forth that are all accessible now.
And one thing I'd add to that, I agree with that mostly. I would just add to that, though, that it's good to remember, and I know Dr. Perry agrees with this, that every author from the ancient world is biased in some sense. I mean, so in some way you're going to find suspicious things. So, for example, how do we find the historical Socrates? I mean, we have Aristophanes, we have Xenophon, we have Plato, and scholars will talk about how Plato clearly puts his views of the forms and different things on Socrates' lips. Did Socrates really believe that? Probably not. But the dialectic method, Socrates definitely, I mean, that probably is sourced in a historical Socrates. But it's 3 devoted followers of Socrates that we're learning about Socrates from. So they're biased, but we learn great things about who Socrates was.
That's a really good example, because that's a case where we have 3 eyewitnesses who actually knew him. We have their texts.
Contemporary, yeah.
Well, I mean, they all knew him. I mean, Socrates sat in the play that Aristophanes wrote about him. And
that's
so
why
we
I
can
brought
look,
up James, Peter, and Paul.
So we can, but we don't have that. We don't have that, right? We don't have the writings of James, Peter, and Paul. We have Paul, but all Paul says is it was Revelations, right?
Well, but Paul says he met with Peter. He hung out with Peter.
Yeah, but all he says...
What did they talk about?
The revelations they had.
The revelations they had. Come on.
Yes, Romans 16.
He uses the word hystereo in Galatians 1. He says to seek out historical information. What was that historical information?
When he had the revelation, what it contained, and so on.
It was about the historical Jesus. He wanted to know everything about Jesus. He wanted to know what it was
possibly.
like. What was it like to deny Jesus? He wanted to know all this.
Yeah, that's a separate question from the resurrection, though. So if you're going to talk about, they want to know about the life of Jesus.
Oh yeah, but we're talking about just reliability.
We're talking about
what we know about.
Yeah, but we're talking about the resurrection. So there's nothing in there that has Paul saying anything regarding the
He says
resurrection.
Peter saw the Lord.
Yeah, but in the same sense that he did, right? Revelation.
Right, but no. Yes, revelation, but bodily appearance, because it's last of all.
Yeah, but he's saying that it appeared not in flesh and blood, but in a revelation, right? And he says in Romans 16, it's revelations and scriptures are the only way people knew about this.
Gentlemen, maybe moving back, and then we'll let you guys have it again.
No, very good.
We don't want to get... let's get back to terminology. What about, for example, resurrection? I mean, we're all just throwing around resurrection here and there, but even that term is really not agreed. And I don't even know if historians, for example,
even in antiquity, that wasn't.
Yeah, Paul believed that we resurrected in new bodies, but the Pharisees believe if I would come back like me, which kind of sucks. I like Paul's resurrection better, or for example, you could be resurrected as a spirit or a phantom. The apostles saw Moses and Abraham. So, what do you mean by resurrection? I guess we would term miraculous, right?
Yeah, I'll let Dr. Bass answer this in a moment, because it does depend on what proposition he's defending. But in terms of the terminology in the ancient world, resurrection usually did not mean just survival of the soul. It meant a transfer of the soul to a new body or to the restored old body. And the words that were used did not distinguish between permanent resurrection and temporary resurrection. So the idea of there's a Christian apologetical distinction between resurrection and revivification, but that distinction did not exist in the ancient terminology. So when you see people talking about the risen Jesus, you have to kind of infer exactly what they mean from other things they say. Just the words themselves don't really tell you what they mean.
The resurrection claim fails basic historical standards. The earliest source, Paul, says he received his message through revelation, not by watching Jesus walk out of a tomb. Galatians 1:12 says his gospel came by revelation of Jesus Christ. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lists appearances, but gives no empty tomb, no guards, no physical evidence, and no independent report. A miracle claim needs stronger proof than visions, faith claims, and later religious stories.
But I do believe, and Paul's pretty clear on this in 1 Corinthians 15, that the belief was that Jesus' soul had been transferred to a superior body and he now resides in that body, right? So the question is, how did they come to that belief? What convinced them of that? And Paul says it was a revelation that convinced him of that. And you might have more to add on that.
And disagreement.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
So yes, I believe that the Jewish understanding of resurrection would be different. I agree that there's other You could even use the word resurrection in some of those cases. But the Jewish nature of resurrection is, I think, unique. Bodily resurrection, again, in a new world, the kingdom of God. And I would say Daniel chapter 12 is very specific to this. Those who are in the dust of the earth will rise, some to everlasting shame, some to shine like the stars. The Maccabees, I think, give us a great example of what I think Paul believed in resurrection. So in 2 Maccabees chapter 7, you have these Maccabean martyrs, each of them dying for their faith. And one of them, it's a great text, he reaches forth his arms and he says, cut off my arms because God will give me them back at the resurrection. And so that's the kind of resurrection I think Paul believed in, and that's clearly the resurrection that Luke believed in. I mean, Jesus received his arms back. He received his legs back. He had the nail marks. So I think that's that kind of resurrection, I would argue, is unique to the Jews, and that's not what the other pagan religions and things believed in.
What do they believe in?
That's actually not the case. That kind of resurrection was present among the pagans. I mean, it's the kind of resurrection that Osiris is explicitly described to receive in the pyramid texts, for example.
He rises again in the underworld.
No, it depends on which story you're talking about. So there's the one where his bodies are assembled and then he rises from his grave. There's that version of it, which is in the pyramid texts. We have Inanna, for example, her actual physical body is restored to life. The one that is killed and hung up is restored to life. It doesn't matter where it happens, but the belief was that this was the actual body she had.
This is different than Jewish resurrection. The key person, that's why I brought it, the key person, and he agrees, is the key text for this, is Mettinger, the riddle of the resurrection, and he spends he actually argues for dying and rising God's pre-Christian, but he spends the last 3 pages discussing how Jesus' resurrection is absolutely unique in the history of religions, absolutely unique, and he is the definitive scholar on this. So I think I'm in good company.
In those pages, he's not talking about this distinction that we're talking about now. We're talking about whether the pagans believed in the restoration of your previous body.
Well, they believed it in a sense, but I'm saying the idea that Jewish and Christian idea about Jesus, that's what's absolutely unique.
Yeah, but this is the problem we have. For example, you have Paul says that the resurrection body is going to be superior, it's going to be invincible, undamageable, and all of these things. So
that's what you would expect from a resurrection body.
Exactly, but this is a body that would not have nail holes in it, right? This is a body that would not have injuries or wounds in it. And so when we get to the description in the Gospel of John, for example, we have a situation where that is not the kind of body Paul would imagine. Paul probably imagined what we have in some of the other Jewish texts, and even N.T. Wright would agree that some versions of resurrection involved a sort of illuminated body, essentially.
Do you think Paul believed in a bodily resurrection of all believers at the end of the world?
Oh, for sure, yeah. And
they would get their bodies back?
And he believed that had happened to Jesus and that was actually at the beginning of the general resurrection. Okay. Yeah, for sure.
And he grounds that later general resurrection in the resurrection of Jesus. And that final resurrection will be bodily. And they'll get their bodies back.
Right,
so
exactly.
Jesus got his body.
That is what he believed. Yeah, absolutely, okay. That's what he believed. Right. And the question is, what made him believe that? And he says it was a revelation of Jesus that caused him to believe that had occurred.
But that's irrelevant to what we're talking about right now. We're talking about whether or not it was a bodily
and I agree. I just don't think that's unique to Judaism. And there were Jews that had different views on that as well.
So historians in Christianity don't agree on what is resurrect? I mean, beyond.
Yeah. No, the reality is there were diverse Jewish sects back then, and there were diverse pagan views, so there's no one answer to this question. But what does matter to the debate is what Dr. Bass is talking about, is what did Paul believe, and that I think represents what the first Christians believed, and that's what's relevant to this debate.
So much hinges on Paul. I mean, it's...
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think Mettinger makes the point that what the Christians were claiming about Jesus was unique in the history of religions. I think that's a very important point to make.
Yeah,
it's absolutely unique.
It's worth reading those pages, anyone who wants to see what Mettinger's actually talking about.
I'll read them out.
Read 3 pages, that's a lot of pages.
Well, I could read just the section. I mean, I think I have it. Hold on. You keep asking, but I have the...
But I mean, is it the part that explains what he thinks is unique about it?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think I have that right here.
Okay, so, and for the crowd, outside of the Bible, we have no first century... recordings of Jesus, of seeing Jesus resurrected.
No.
So it's all within the Bible.
Well, there's made up stories, but
it's important.
Apocrypha in the first century?
Yeah. No, the first. You're right. First century, there's not. It's second century and beyond. But so far as we know. Anyway.
But it's important to remember that the Bible is, a bunch of different books. If you don't take it as the Word of God in just one book, right? It's a bunch of individual books. So someone like Bart Ehrman is going to look at the Bible, the New Testament, and he's going to sift out what he thinks. He thinks the whole thing is unreliable, but he's still going to sift out sources that he thinks are reliable to tell him this about Jesus, this about the empty tomb, or this about this. So So just because it's within the Bible, and to make that clear, that doesn't mean you throw the whole thing out. I mean, these are historical sources for, just like the biased authors of talking about Socrates, we learn a lot about Socrates from these biased.
Yeah. Except none of them
writers.
are eyewitnesses. That's the difference.
Paul's not an eyewitness?
But again, Paul only says revelation. He
And
doesn't
James
talk
and
about
Peter.
anything else. Yeah, but all he says is revelation. He doesn't talk
doesn't
about
say-
any other experience of meeting Jesus. He doesn't say anyone meets Jesus any other way. Even in Romans 16, the only thing he mentions that people had was revelation.
So you think if Jesus appeared to people, it wouldn't be a revelation? You think there's
You
a
mean
way
an
for
actual physical, like if he actually
Jesus,
rose from the dead?
if he actually rose from the dead, I mean, wouldn't it, no matter
Well, it
what, be a
wouldn't.
revelation?
It wouldn't matter. It's still, because if it's a revelation, then you don't know if it's that or not. That's the question. You can't tell.
But I think you can, because I just argued it, because Paul believes in a general resurrection that's bodily. He grounds it in the resurrection
yeah,
of
but if you
Jesus.
have a
So it
hallucination or
shows
a
him-
dream that says Jesus now is risen in a body,
But
and
he
that's
didn't
what
have it
you
in a
believe.
dream. There's nothing about him having
Okay,
a dream.
that might be another
Yeah,
part of the terminology.
that's true, yeah.
Revelation, apocalypse in Greek. Is that what
Yeah,
you're
revelation.
talking about? And a
Apocalypse.
revelation is when a God actually appears before you or
Appears to you.
within
Something
you.
supernatural.
It's within.
I mean, that-
so it's
anything
usually,
supernatural.
well, it has both actually. We have
Anything supernatural.
pagans who say that God's appeared to them in person in front of them and told them things. We have actual eyewitness examples of this in the record. But there's also people who that God comes to them in their dream and tells them things, and they believe that's a real communication, and they also call that a revelation. So Paul doesn't distinguish, so we don't know which he's talking about. But we can take it as hallucination if you want, like waking hallucination. Many pagan gods or pagan worshippers of gods had these experiences. We have many other examples, like cargo cults are an example of that. The ghost dance movement is an example of that. So we have that. We know that's a thing. So the question is, we have now to determine if someone says God appeared to them in Revelation and says, now I've been resurrected and the general resurrection has begun, the end is nigh. How do you tell the difference between that being a hallucination and that being a genuine actual appearance of a God? We don't have the kind of records we need to tell that distinction, to tell those two apart.
Christianity has a major problem here. Even its own sources do not agree on what resurrection means. Paul describes the resurrected body as transformed, powerful, and spiritual in 1 Corinthians 15, 42-44. But John 20:27 shows Jesus still carrying wounds and inviting Thomas to touch them. That is not a clean match. The story changes depending on the author. When a religion cannot clearly define its central miracle, that is not evidence. That is theology trying to cover confusion.
Okay.
We can keep talking about that, but I completely disagree. Let me quote Mettinger.
Okay, go ahead, and then I'll ask another question.
So he says, there is, as far as I'm aware, no prima facie evidence that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct, drawing on the myths and rites of the dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. While studied with profit against the background of Jewish resurrection belief, the faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus retains its unique character in the history of religions. The riddle remains. That's how he ends the book.
What are the unique character?
Well, the three would be, it was a historical event, crucifixion, empty tomb. Other gods died and rose not in history or on the earth. Dying and rising gods were related to the seasonal cycle. Jesus' death and resurrection was a one-time event. Jesus dies for the sins of, the sins of his people. No other example involves paying for sins.
Well, it depends on how you do it, because that's the Jewish angle of it. The Osiris cult had a similar thing where your sins weighed you down, and you would actually go to hell if you were weighed on the scales of Ma'at. If you went through the death and resurrection of Osiris through baptism, which symbolized the death and resurrection of Osiris, and you would share in his death and resurrection, those sins would be erased so that you would not weigh the scales and you would actually go to heaven. So that's a similar kind of concept. And we have this also in the Bacchic mystery cults, where people were cleansed of their sins through baptism. And you could even be baptized for the dead, someone who died before they'd gone through the correct baptism ritual. You could baptize yourself on their behalf. And we see in Paul, he's talking about the same thing, baptism for the dead in 1 Corinthians 15. So it's a very similar cultic idea of baptism for the dead to cleanse people
And
of
what's
sins.
our primary source for Osiris again?
For Osiris, well, that would, for the whole discussion of the ritual, would be Apuleius, but we have examples from earlier of his resurrection story. But we're talking about the baptism aspect of it.
Yeah. Post-Christian.
Right, but the Bacchic Baptist stuff, we have in inscriptions that are pre-Christian, actual stone inscriptions that are pre-Christian. So we know that for a fact.
That,
And in
says,
Plato,
that says dying for sins?
no, that says you can be cleansed of sins through baptism, right? And so the concepts are all there. It's not really that
So
particular.
Mettinger, you either agree with Mettinger.
Yeah, well, that particular angle of it is incorrect. But there's also, you have Romulus and Zalmoxis are also examples of historical. They're placed in history. Their resurrections are one-time events and occur in
Romulus
historical time.
doesn't resurrect. He disappears. He's exalted to heaven. There's nothing about resurrection.
Yeah, his body disappears and he appears in a body to Proculus on the road.
Does he use the word resurrection? Does he use anastasis or any of that?
I can't remember if he does,
No,
but
it
doesn't matter.
I've read it.
If you die and you appear bodily again, you're resurrected. You have a new
It
body.
doesn't say he died. It just says he vanished.
It does say
It's like
he was-
Elijah.
yeah, no, the story was he was cut.
No, there's
he was
many
cut
stories.
apart.
Come on,
Yeah,
you know the text. I mean, it talks
Yeah.
about like 10 different. The guy's like, I got 10 different stories on Romulus. Let me go through the list.
yeah, but that's the whole point. Is that that the idea was that Romulus died. That's actually because Plutarch has a whole thing about why he thinks it's ridiculous.
What I see you doing, and I'm not saying you're doing it to deceive, but I'm just saying you seem to. You take a bunch of different stories and you try to make them sound as Christian as possible. When I actually go to the stories, it doesn't seem that way at all.
Yeah, but I don't do that in particular.
That's why I wish we would go to the primary sources.
Is that Romulus is believed
doesn't see this.
All it was Romulus is believed to have died, and that was the thing. And then he was believed to have returned again.
No,
All right, we don't have to talk about Romulus. We are talking
Let's talk about Jesus.
Yeah, I think of Romulus, think of sucking the wolf off or whatever he's doing.
Oh yeah, that
Kind of gets me excited, but
that story actually is pretty X-rated.
Yeah.
we don't want to talk about that story. There's children in the room. I've seen children in this room.
Twofold question, and it's going to be a different question for each of you. Dr. Carrier, what do you see any good arguments for the historicity of Jesus? Something you wake up in the middle of the night like, oh my God, this might. And I'm not trying to be. For example, Robert Price always says if he was going to be convinced, he'd go with the James Calvin theory that there was a very strong church close to the time of Jesus with James, very Jewish, very close, who believed in Jesus, and he thinks that might. Is there any argument that you say, okay?
Nothing that keeps me up at night. But I want to emphasize that that's a question about historicity, which is different from the question of the resurrection. So if we grant that Jesus existed, then we can talk about whether we have adequate evidence that he died.
You got books in the back arguing Jesus didn't exist.
I know, but I'm just saying that's not what this debate. That's not what this debate is about. But to answer your question, I think
if Jesus resurrected, we have to establish that he existed. I mean, for him to die, he has to rise again.
Yeah, but if we're going to argue about just the stuff about his resurrection, we can grant, for the sake of argument, historicity and then move on.
It's kind of cheating, though, because you have to grant something you don't even believe to make arguments.
No. It's just a practical way to narrow down the subject, as we don't have 10 hours to debate this. We've only got 2.
So you don't see any good arguments? You don't see any good arguments?
No, the best arguments, and you can see that in my book, I actually assign them, I actually make them evidence for historicity, actually, in the a fortiori estimates, which are the estimates most against my position that I can reasonably believe possible. Which are the 3 passages in Paul where he alludes to Jesus being of Davidic seed and being born of a mother, and James the brother of the Lord. So those are the best evidence, and I think they're weak evidence, but they are the best evidence they have, and there really is no other evidence. All the other evidence dissolves upon examination. And like I said, when I do the final math in there, I actually count those as in favor of historicity against all the other evidence that we have. Now, I personally think that there's much better explanations for those passages. I think they're actually weird if you try to interpret them in that sense, in the historicity sense. But that's a whole other debate. Like, literally, we could debate just those 3 passages for 2 hours. So,
and I'd love to.
That's what we got to do in Dallas. No, seriously, we got to do this.
And Dr. Bass, you're talking about, again, the uniqueness of the story of Jesus. But the reality is that his story does parallel a lot of pagan stories, the dying, rising, the renewal of the world. I mean, even C.S. Lewis said Jesus was the myth come alive. And St. Augustine talked about Christianity as existed from the beginning of time because he saw these stories just recycling themselves. So why do you think the parallels?
Well, yeah, and I agree with. I think there's 2 ways to look at it. I think what Lewis and Tolkien and really goes back to G.K. Chesterton, they're arguing that God prepared the minds, just as he prepared the minds of the Jews with the prophecies of the Messiah to come. He prepared the pagans with ideas of virgin births and different things, and he prepared that. Now, I grant that. I think that makes sense to me. But at the same time, when you actually go and look at the evidence, and like Mettinger, the definitive work on the resurrection in the ancient world, you find that the story of Jesus is actually unique, though, in comparison to all the others. There's a unique nature of it that's unparalleled. And so that's what I think is... so I emphasize both, actually, because I love Tolkien and Lewis. And
but it could still be a unique lie or a unique fiction.
Every single one of them was unique, though. All of them were unique. Osiris is unique compared to Romulus, for example. Zalmoxis is unique compared to the others. Inanna is unique compared to the others. Even Mithras is an example where Mithras is not a dying and rising God, but he's still a similar savior figure, and it's still different, but the commonalities are there because he still has a passion, he still goes through a suffering and struggle through which he gains victory over death. So there are these common themes, and you see them all around the Mediterranean before the rise of Christianity. You do not see them in China, for example.
Can I quote you, though, on
Sure.
historical Jesus? You said there is no evidence that Mithras was a resurrected Savior.
Right.
In history.
He's not a resurrected Savior.
Okay.
No, he underwent a passion. He underwent a struggle or suffering, and actually the actual word of passion, for example. He had that kind of thing, but it wasn't a death and resurrection. But for some other gods, there were. Okay. But that's the similarity, is these are all Savior gods. They all go through some sort of suffering that actually leads to their victory over death that they share with their followers through baptism and communal meals. And so when you see this all around the Mediterranean, then suddenly each culture is getting their own version of this. The Egyptians are getting it, the Persians in the Roman Empire are producing one, the Syrians have one, the Greeks have one, and so on. And then the Jews finally come up with one. Now, normally what we say in that's cultural diffusion. That's an example of a fashion spreading from culture to culture to culture. Each culture is taking it and turning it into their own version of it. So they Judaize it. So what makes what makes Jesus unique is all the Jewish parts of it, how they took the Jewish ideas and made a savior God out of the Jewish religion using the basic structure around them.
The outside evidence does not rescue Christianity. Tacitus only confirms that Christians existed and that Jesus was executed under Pilate. He does not confirm a resurrection. Josephus mentions James, the brother of Jesus, but again gives no proof of a miracle. The best non-Christian sources support a dead preacher and a later movement, not a risen God. That is a massive gap religion tries to fill with faith.
The fact that this didn't occur in China, we don't have any dying and rising God in China, in ancient China anyway. We don't have any of this trend of these mystery cults, these salvation cults. We don't have baptism and communal meal cults in there. So we can see the difference that it didn't arise there because there was no fashion for it, but there was a fashion for it, and that's exactly when Christianity arose, is precisely when it was fashionable for this kind of cult to arise.
What about Bruce Lee?
What do you mean about Bruce Lee?
Rising and dying.
But again, like Mettinger says, it's the historical figure of Jesus, and that's the thing. So if he grants the historical figure, that's what's different than all the other dying
that's a good
gods.
point.
They're all deities.
Yeah,
so they're all nobody thinks that they're actually humans that walk the earth that were crucified, and we have the evidence within 2 years that all this happened, and so that is completely, absolutely unique.
Yeah, except
and not borrowing from any pagan religions, because
the
pagan religions.
They did believe that Osiris walked the earth, that he was an actual person on Earth.
But what's the primary source? What's the dating between?
We don't have any
Osiris?
reliable sources for Jesus either on this. But again,
we don't have 1 Corinthians 15 that's dated within 2 years.
Yeah. Well,
when do you date
if we're
that,
talking about resurrection, the creeds.
Yeah, the creed.
I don't put a particular date on it. I'm completely fine with 1 Corinthians 15 and Philippians 2 dating to the origin of the religion. They could have been written down by Peter himself
So
the day after.
You put it
he had his
right
revelation.
there at the early.
Yeah, I would. I don't know for sure, but I would.
That's evidence. I mean, that's strong evidence.
But
you guys keep bringing up Peter.
Yeah.
But Peter was. I'm sorry.
Define evidence.
Define evidence. Yeah. What's the?
It depends on which thing you're talking about.
Yeah. You talk about Peter, but Peter was an illiterate fisherman.
Well, so the Gospels claim.
That's what the Gospels.
Yeah,
claim.
I think it's extremely unlikely. Because when you see Paul talking about interacting with Peter in the epistles, Paul defers to him a lot, or at least considers him an equal. If it were the case that Paul could read the scriptures and Peter could not, Paul would lord it all over him on that fact. He would say, I know the scriptures, I can read the damn scriptures, who are you? But that never comes up. He treats him like an equal. He treats him like he knows what he's talking about, that he can actually read the scriptures. So I think Peter was probably a rabbi the same as Paul. And the idea of him becoming a literate fisherman is a similar thing that we see throughout religions to sort of make the movement more miraculous, just the same way the Muslims do with Muhammad and claim that Muhammad was illiterate and therefore he couldn't have written the Quran. That's a made-up story. Muhammad was the son of one of the wealthiest families, mercantile families in the Arabian Peninsula. There's no way he was illiterate, right? So it's highly improbable. But nonetheless, they told that story to make it more miraculous that he could start this religion. So I think the Gospels are doing the same thing with the original apostles. I think the original apostles, in reality, were probably well-educated rabbis. They knew what they were talking about.
All the evidence goes against what he just said, but that's okay. But,
Only the Gospels.
And the Gospels
Only
are
the
considered
Gospels.
reliable. I mean, I have this here. Burridge, what are the Gospels? This is the definitive scholarly work on the Gospels, and the virtually unanimous consensus is the Gospels should be paralleled with Greco-Roman bias. biographies and that they are historical. Now many scholars like Bart Ehrman would say, well, they're still very unreliable. We can't trust a lot of things in them.
Many of them are outright false, yeah.
But overly, we can trust
There are
many historical
biographies.
details. One of them is that Peter was a fisherman. I mean,
Yeah, no, that's
you question
exactly
that. That's part of
that's
your
exactly the
imagination.
kind of that's
not
exactly the kind of
actual
thing
evidence.
ancient biographies made up. We have
You just
many
read.
examples.
You just read that into Galatians. You didn't get that anywhere except here, right?
No,
The idea that
reading
Peter
the letters.
was a rabbi. Where did you get that Peter was
Looking,
a rabbi?
all I do is infer this way, that Paul treats him like an equal and treats him like he can actually read the scriptures.
But it began here. This is where it began.
No, it began in the letters of Paul.
No. You reading the Paul. Why didn't anybody else discover that in the last 2,000 years?
Well, it's because people have been believing the gospel, taking them at face value. When you look
Right,
at... when
that's
you-
true.
Ehrman does
They've
this
been
as
looking at
well.
the evidence.
Bart Ehrman does this as well, is he doesn't look at actual classical literature on biography, which is extremely suspicious of almost all the contents of our biographies.
Does Burris look at actual classical literature?
If he doesn't come to this conclusion, then he didn't. But the point of the matter is...
Because you say so.
We have biographies of non-existent people, Romulus, Theseus, and so on. So there were biographies
I've
of
read them,
non-existent people. So you can't say that because it's a biography, therefore it's reliable. You have completely fictional stories by completely fictional people.
And they were
presented as
gods,
historical people. We have many biographies where some of the experts on those things, like the biographies of Homer, the biographies of Euripides, the biographies of the early pre-Socratics, classicists who've analyzed these have found that the stories that are in them, they took things that were written in these people's books and then spun them out into stories about their lives and invented the whole biography of these people. That's the way biographies were written. There are some biographies that maybe are based on eyewitness evidence, for example, Xenophon's biographies. But that's because, but that's the thing is Xenophon says how he knows his subjects when he talks about biographical material. We don't have that in the Gospels.
Well, it's great when we have independent, corroborating details from Paul, from the Gospels, from the early traditions.
But not that
from
relate,
even Josephus and Tacitus.
But not that relate to these details.
All these corroborate these details.
Only the fact that they believe Jesus died and was buried and appeared to them and told them that he was resurrected.
Gentlemen, why don't,
that's it.
yeah.
A lot of other things.
Let's move to some questions because the crowd's getting some beer and they're getting antsy. And
Actually,
I don't want to be the one crucified tonight if I can help it. So
can I ask Rich one question?
sure,
Yeah,
one
let's
question and then we'll go to the audience.
Something I was wanting to ask you because you make a big deal about and you did in your writings and you did tonight that Paul converting was we would expect that for an early movement, and so I was just is that correct?
We would expect.
Sorry,
That was that.
that was God.
Boom!
No,
Or Zeus.
we would expect
No,
that to
Zeus
be.
doesn't exist. We know
We
that.
would expect that to be very infrequent, and the fact that it only happened once is by definition infrequent.
Right. So I mean, in Mormonism, for example, who is the person that persecuted Mormonism and then converted and then became a famous Mormon? Who's that guy?
I don't study
They
Mormonism
don't-
enough to
yeah.
answer that question.
They don't exist. What about Muslim? Who persecuted the early Muslims and then became a Muslim himself and then became a famous Muslim?
You don't think that's ever happened?
But
Are you banking your reputation on that? That if I go out now on the internet,
I know. Hey, trust me. I know at least with the big religions that didn't happen, and so this is by definition extraordinary
you're
for
saying,
Christianity.
You're saying no one has been against a religion and then has converted to that
I'm not
religion?
saying no. I'm saying with the biggest religions, find evidence for Hinduism,
Wait,
for
no.
Buddhism, for Mormonism, for
Even if we're talking
Islam.
the biggest religions, you're saying
If some of you
that
on your
no one.
smartphones, maybe you can look some
You're
evidence.
saying no one in history has ever
I didn't
persecuted.
say no one. I'm showing you that
I'm saying
Christianity
it's
sets
infrequent.
apart.
I'm saying it's
It's set
infrequent.
apart with the Paul story.
You're agreeing
That's
it's infrequent, though.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah, and look at this one dude out of hundreds. That's
We
by
can
definition.
compare it with other religions, though, so it's an extraordinary thing.
No,
I mean,
it's
when you say you
statistics.
want extraordinary evidence, I just don't know what extraordinary means for you because
No,
we have
extraordinary.
early.
No, dude,
we
you got
have-
it backwards. Extraordinary is if all the Sanhedrin were converted. That would be extraordinary. One guy who's not even on the Sanhedrin, who's like some random dude he's not even a Judean Jew, he's a diaspora Jew. One dude.
He did
who's
so
persecuting
little.
the church.
He did so
One
little.
guy.
Paul's letters were not even
We're talking
important
hundreds, if
until
not
the,
thousands,
what?
of persecutors of Christianity. None of them have this experience. One dude does. That's infrequent. That's exactly what you'd expect if
And
it's
Paul
some
wasn't
random.
even popular. I mean, Tertullian calls him what? The apostle to the heretic? I mean, the Gnostics were more interested in his writings until...
Well, I think we've established.
I don't know about
he,
that,
He hopes that if he Googled it, he'd find someone. But we've established that there is a unique thing with religions, with Christianity. That's
I'm
absolutely.
not sure what you're claiming, because what you're claiming doesn't sound logical
All
at all.
right, we can get
Okay.
back to that. Why don't we go to the questions?
All right, let's have a round of applause for both of the participants again. And thanks so much.
Christianity leans too hard on weak evidence. The Gospels say Peter was an ordinary fisherman, and Acts 4:13 even calls Peter and John unschooled, ordinary men. Then, apologists turn around and treat the movement like it was built on strong historical witnesses. That is a problem. A biography can sound historical and still be full of legend. One dramatic convert like Paul does not prove a miracle. It proves religious movements can win people over.
This is actually more for Dr. Bass than it is for Dr. Carrier. But Dr. Bass, I know in Mark 16:1 they talk about Mary Magdalene and Jesus curing her for 7 demons, 7 devils. And also in John 21-2, they talk about Mary Magdalene being the first to see the tomb empty. And then Paul comes along in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which we all love, about how women should be quiet in church, and if they have a question, they should ask their husbands afterwards. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Okay.
I know it really doesn't have a lot to do with the resurrection of Jesus, except for
Well,
Mary
okay.
being Mary Magdalene being the first to see the tomb open as
Okay.
a woman.
Well, okay. On the first point, I just want to make the point that the quote that you did about Mary Magdalene casting out 7
Jesus.
demons being casted out, that's in the longer ending of Mark, which I don't actually consider to be scripture. I think that was added later, clearly. So that's not there. But in John 20, what you are looking for is what happened in John 20, because Mary Magdalene actually becomes kind of the apostle. She's the one who tells the apostles, "I have seen the Lord." And so you have this very high, exalted picture of a woman in the Gospel of John, for sure. Now, why Mary Magdalene isn't, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene in the Creed, I don't know that. I don't know the particular answer to that. Clearly, Peter, Peter, even according to the Gospels, Jesus appears to him very soon after the women. So it just seems like Peter, hey, if we're going to put a creed together, let's say Peter first. This maybe there had something to do with the women's testimony in that time. I don't know. I just don't know the answer to that. But John 20 is what you like. I mean, John 20 is exalting Mary, and Paul even refers to some women as apostles.
Well, okay, I'm being told one question.
It's okay. Go
I
ahead.
gotta walk away.
question.
We'll talk about that later. About
Okay.
the rest of that.
Okay, good question.
Thank
Good
you.
question.
Kevin, what do you got?
I got one comment and then one question. My one comment is Lazarus was risen from the dead before Jesus. He was dead for 3 days and raised. So it's my
He died
resurrection.
again, but okay.
But he's raised from the dead. So the question I have is about what you think about Paul's account. Mark talked about this, about the revelation being in Paul. When he looked at it, he saw the Son being revealed in him in Galatians, the revelation, and his account in Acts of being knocked off the horse,
Yeah.
and then seeing him. Are those? I guess what do you say about both of those events? Because both of those events seem to be different experiences that he had. What do you think about the two? The revelation that he had in him and the account of him being knocked off the horse and blinded.
Yeah, well, it never says he's knocked off a horse,
Well,
but it does,
He's blinded and
Yeah, the account is definitely different. So
yeah.
I would say,
Okay, so are they the same or different? And what do you think about both for both you guys?
I would say that Galatians 1 is Paul's first-person account, and he is, I think, giving a more inner experience of what that happened. So it says, literally, the Son was revealed in me. It's the word "in me" in the Greek. And so I think he's just, if Jesus actually appeared to him bodily, which I think he did, he would have also had an inner experience as well. And so I think he's emphasizing that inner experience of what happened when Jesus appeared to him. Now, the book of Acts is Luke giving us the account of what happened. Now, I think we do have agreement with the Galatians account because he says very soon after in Galatians 1 that I returned to Damascus. So you have this, parallel with corroborating aspect of Damascus. So I do think it's the same account, but yeah, one's a first-person account from Paul, one's Luke telling us what happened. So there of course is going to be differences, but I don't think they're contradictory.
I think they do. Paul says that when he had the revelation, he went immediately to Arabia for 3 years before returning to Damascus. Luke has him immediately go to Damascus and then consult with an actual Christian apostle and actually immediately get inducted into the religion by a Christian. former Christian believer, that absolutely contradicts what Paul says. Paul's very adamant that he never spoke to any actual apostles until at least 3 years later when he eventually went to Jerusalem. And even then he doesn't mention meeting Ananias. He talks about meeting Cephas and possibly James. So yeah, I see those as contradictions. I think Acts is writing a story that's very similar to what people imagined at the time to be these revelations. So that may have been just a generic idea of how God appears to people or how Jesus appears to people, and he wove a narrative about it. I don't think he's getting it from Paul. But it is interesting to note that they are both revelatory experiences, even if you're going to have hysterical blindness associated with them, which is entirely the kind of thing that does happen throughout history in different religious cults. So I think there's tying up there. They tie together in terms of the culture of the time, in terms of what visions were like for people.
If I could just add to that, I think it's too strong to say absolutely a contradiction, because we know Luke doesn't include everything he knows. And we know that because we know, and Dr. Gary agrees, that Luke had Mark when he was writing, and there's large portions of Mark that he leaves out. Great things, Jesus walking on water, things that you'd think he would put in. You'd say, oh, of course Luke would put that in. Well, we know he didn't, and we know he knew about it because he had Mark before him. And so just because he doesn't mention the fact that he went to Arabia doesn't mean he didn't go to Arabia, doesn't mean he didn't even know about it. So I don't think it doesn't show it. It's just an argument from silence. It's
No, that doesn't work at all, because Acts says he goes immediately to Damascus and is blind until he gets to Damascus, and then interacts with Ananias, who cures him of his blindness.
He says in Galatians that he returned to Damascus and then went to Arabia.
Yes. No, he returned to Damascus 3 years after. He said he immediately goes to Arabia, comes back 3 years later. So unless Paul was blind for 3 years...
The language in Acts allows for the going to Arabia.
I don't think so.
Okay, good deal. Arthur George, mythologist, what do you got for us?
Yeah, it was interesting to me that neither of you spoke much about the empty tomb tradition. It was mostly about the appearance tradition, and I'd like to hear more from each of you about that. If you could comment on the historicity of that, and in particular, to focus on three things. One, Paul didn't mention the empty tomb either, and I'm wondering whether either of you think he had heard about that, and why he didn't mention it. And second, what's interesting also to me is that in all four Gospels, the information that Christ has risen came from an angelic being and was transferred to the humans by the angelic being. So I wonder if the information comes from an angelic being, how do you get to historicity on the basis of that kind of testimony? And thirdly, it turned out, nevertheless, that the people did not believe the empty tomb traditions. If you look at what happened after the angelic beings talked, the people didn't believe it. It took the appearances for people to believe it.
I agree.
So ultimately, why the empty tomb tradition? Paul doesn't mention it. We have angelic beings, as if that's really reliable, and the people didn't believe it anyway. They still relied on the appearances.
The empty tomb story falls apart when you compare the Gospels side by side. Mark says the women fled and told no one. Matthew says they ran to tell the disciples. Luke adds 2 men in dazzling clothes. John turns it into a different scene with Mary alone at first. These are not small details. This is the main miracle claim, and the witnesses, timeline, and reactions keep changing.
Richard, you want to take that one first?
I thought that was a question directed at you.
Justin, if you go first, I would prefer.
Okay, yeah. I believe in the empty tomb traditions. I think it shows and demonstrates that the bodily resurrection. We have it in the Mark, and many scholars argue for a pre-Markan passion narrative. I think Peter's just behind Mark, so we don't need that. But we also have an interesting case in Acts where it says in Paul's sermon in Acts 13 that they buried him. It uses the plural, and so you have this burial of Jesus that's not specifically, I don't think it's contradictory, but it's it, because I think Joseph of Arimathea probably needed help to bury Jesus. But it's interesting that you have this different account, and so that's one of those evidences of maybe a pre-literary tradition of the sermons in Acts chapter 13. But scholars like Gaze of Hermesh, who is a late Jewish scholar, he says that when all the arguments come together, you have a tomb that was empty. I mean, the historical evidence strongly points to an empty tomb when you look at the multiple accounts John also. So you have the Acts sermons, you have Mark, you have the John. And about Paul, let me specifically answer that. So he says he was buried. It's the aorist passive. Buried by who? And so if Paul believed in a bodily resurrection, wherever he was buried, it would have been empty after he rose from the dead. But one thing I completely agree with you is that it was the appearances that made them believe. It wasn't the empty tomb, even according to the Gospels. I mean, they get to the empty tomb and they're like scratching their heads. What happened? What happened? And I think that goes against, that strongly supports the expectation that even the disciples of Jesus had. They didn't expect him to rise from the dead. They thought for sure this was done, just like all the other 14 movements that I mentioned. When their leader was crucified, it was done. He's not the Messiah. So for some reason, they decided that this crucified man was the Messiah, even though that's not the case in the 14 other movements. So what happened? I mean, you got to explain what happened.
Yeah.
And that argues for the resurrection.
But that's all based on the Gospels, which we can't trace to any eyewitness source, any named eyewitness source at all. So just the fact that they're telling these stories doesn't mean we don't have this account from an actual apostle who actually went to the tomb and saw it empty. Paul doesn't mention there being an empty tomb. He never mentions anyone discovering it. It's never part of their creed. It's never part of the evidence that he thinks is relevant to his story. The only time it first appears is in Mark, decades later, many decades later. And Mark is writing a story in which he has it end with the women not telling anyone about the empty tomb, right? So it seems to me that he's doing a literary construct, that the empty tomb is symbolic for him. It represents the thing that he wants to communicate. It's not a story that he actually learned from anyone who was there. And certainly we don't have any way to prove that it was a story from anyone who was there. He doesn't cite any witnesses as being his source for that story. And so we have no idea where he got the story or where it came from. And then all the other versions of the empty tomb story are just embellishments on that. You get like Matthew, now he adds angels flying down from heaven and striking the guards, half dead, even though there were no guards there in Mark. Mark had never heard of guards or any of this story, but Matthew makes this big fabulous story out of it. Luke gets rid of the guards and the flying angel, but he has two angels instead of the one young man. And then he has this whole sequence of events where the women go and tell the men, and then the men come and double check the tomb. It just gets more elaborate over time. So I think generally when you're looking at myths like this, you're looking at stories like this, they look like myths, and so we don't usually believe these things as being the case.
And just add to that, if you go back to the actual beliefs of Paul, if he believed in a bodily resurrection, then wherever Jesus was buried, whatever the tomb it was, whatever it was, it would have been empty. And that's exactly what Marcus Bachmuel in the Cambridge Companion to Jesus, he makes that exact point. He says wherever Jesus was buried, he doesn't even fully, I think, subscribe to the empty tomb, but he says, Paul says he was buried, and wherever he was buried, it would have been empty after Jesus rose from the dead.
Yeah. First of all, that would be an inference.
Resurrection.
That would be an inference, not actual evidence of it being empty, right? You can believe that it's empty without having checked or being able to check. But the other thing is that Paul actually goes out of his way to say that the body that dies is not the body that rises. And he talks about it being two separate bodies. We have examples like in Josephus, and Josephus' description of the Essenic belief in resurrection was that the old body gets thrown away and a new body is replaced.
No. Josephus uses anabio, the exact same word that's used in the second Maccabees 7.
That just means
the exact same word.
That just means up to life. It doesn't matter.
But he's using the same word that the Maccabean. Yeah. You don't think a Pharisee like Josephus or Paul would have been inspired by the Maccabean?
Paul said Phariseeism was rubbish. He said he rejected the Pharisee cult. That's right. That's in Philippians, right? He says it was all as awful to me. He's got rid of his Pharisee.
Well, he's talking about his previous background of not knowing Christ. Yeah, but he's not talking about. He claims to be a Pharisee in the book of Acts.
No, he abandoned all.
He says, "I'm a Pharisee, the son of the Pharisees."
No, he says he was a Pharisee. He's no longer.
No, he says, "I'm a son of the Pharisees."
People can change sects. You can have a Catholic become a Protestant, or a Protestant become a Catholic. The same way you can have a Pharisee become a Christian.
But the point is, if Paul and Josephus stayed a Pharisee, if they believed in if they were inspired by the Maccabean martyrs, you definitely agree. Believe in bodily resurrection.
Paul never references the
same body,
but he never references that. That's one Jewish belief. Paul says in 2 Corinthians.
We know that Josephus definitely talks
2 Corinthians 5.
Gentlemen, better one question.
Thanks, Miguel.
I have to say, 2 Corinthians 5. Paul says our resurrection bodies are already built. They're already waiting for us in heaven. So that's a separate body.
You're taking a very, very multiple different interpretations of the passage. When we're talking about 1 Corinthians 15, it's a transformed body.
It's a big line there.
Thanks,
Arthur.
Thank you. I'll follow up with a beer.
Absolutely.
Rome used crucifixion as public humiliation. Victims were not treated like honored guests with clean linen and elite tombs. Jesus was executed under the charge, King of the Jews, which Rome would see as political rebellion. Yet the gospel story gives him a respectful burial by a council member. That sounds less like hard history and more like religion cleaning up an ugly execution. So here's the real question. If the resurrection is the biggest claim in Christianity, why is the evidence still so unclear, inconsistent, and dependent on faith? Do you think the sources are strong enough, or does the story fall apart under historical pressure? Comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more breakdowns like this.